Incoming EC Web Setting Tutorial. Tutorial video number 12. Inverter Settings. Inverter settings will be used to interface your inverters to ECPV2. Incoming controller manage the inverter production based on the reading received by inverters or inverter controllers. The EC Web settings depends on inverter protocol types and installation. ECPV2 support both RTU and TCP inverter communication for both unicast and broadcast type installations. Let's go through the settings and find out how you can edit the inverter setting for your own site installation. Before move to the EC Web setting, you have to make sure that your inverters have named correctly for EC Web setting requirements. All your inverter IP address for TCP connection and Modbus ID number for RTU connection has to be set in sequential manner. And your connection should be in a daisy chain manner. What is a daisy chain installation? Daisy chain installation is a wiring scheme in which multiple devices are wired together in sequence or in a ring, similar to a garland of daisy flowers. Daisy chains may be used for power, analog signals, digital data, or a combination thereof. How to do the RTU communication settings for inverters. On the EC Web, go to the settings and you will reach the first page where you have to select COM port 3. ECPV2 COM port 3 is reserved for inverter RTU communication. Please refer video tutorial number 7 for port RS485 port setting. Once you have done the port setting, continue to inverter setting. There you have to edit the inverter settings. Inverter setting depends on the inverter interfacing method. Let's check the different method of inverter interfacing and related settings. ECPV2 can be interfaced directly to a single or pool of inverters. Or it can be interfaced to a single or pool of inverters through a single inverter controller. Unicast is applicable when interfacing to a single unit. This can be a single inverter or a single controller managing pool of inverters. Let's find out the Unicast setting on the EC Web. When you open the inverter setting, first option you have to select your inverter protocol type. For example, if you use SunSpec inverter, you have to select SunSpec protocol from the drop-down menu. Please check Incoming website for supported inverters. Next you need to select RTU communication. Next you have to find out your inverter control function code. Consult the Modbus master documentation on Incoming website to learn which function code to use with your inverter. ECPV2 supports Modbus function code 0x06 and 0x10 for applying control commands. Some inverters support only one of the two. Next you have to enable control function and acquisition. If you enable the control function, then only your ECPV2 controller can do any controlling functions for your settings. If you are not enabled the control function, then no control over inverters by ECPV2. And when you enable data acquisition, the ECPV2 receive the data from the inverter and visualize the data on the monitoring page. Finally, you have to enter the number of inverters on your installation and save your editing. Next you have to move to the RTU specification editings, where you have to select Unicast option. Then your ECPV2 can apply references as Unicast. Under the Unicast selection, next you have to set the initialization ID. The initialization ID is used for any protocol initialization routine such as SunSpec map identification. After that you have to enter the control ID is used for Unicast. If your inverter's connected to an inverter manager, then the control ID has to match that inverter manager. If no managing controller is present, the control ID shall be set equal to the acquisition ID. The acquisition ID shall be set equal to the lowest inverter ID on your installation. When acquisition is enabled, the device will read data from the inverters. ECPv2 will read acquisition ID from low onwards until the number of selected inverters reached. The IDs of the inverters must be sequential. RTU specification setting with broadcast control type will be applicable when the controller interfaced directly to pool of inverters without a inverter manager. Go to the RTU specification setting and select broadcast as the control type for this setting. The ECPv2 can apply references as broadcast. Then do the rest of the settings same as explained on the Unicast editing. In case the inverters do not support broadcast, a pool of inverters can be still controlled by using Unicast. In this case, control ID should be set equal to the acquisition ID. How to do the setting for different inverters connected on the same daisy chain? You have to name the inverter IDs in sequence and connect them in the sequence order. Go to the setting and select the port 3 and do the setting for the same type inverters in the main inverter setting. There you have to select the protocol to the same inverters you are using. Then do the rest of the setting as it should be and then select the number of inverters for this protocol and save the setting. Then go to the advanced inverter setting and navigate to the secondary inverter setting. There you have to select the inverter protocol for the other inverter connected on your installation. And select correct control function, then you have to select the number of inverters. Then finally enable the control and acquisition function and save your setting. When you use the TCP connection to ECPv2 from inverter, the following scenarios of installation can be found. First scenario is ECPv2 connected to pool of inverters without a inverter controller. And the second scenario is ECPv2 connected to single or pool of inverters through a inverter controller. For example, SMA Inverter Manager. Please note Unicast and broadcast selection has no effect for TCP communication. Let's find out how the EC Web Inverter TCP connection setting for this kind of installation. Move to the TCP setting sub-menu and click on the Edit button. There you have the IP address editing option for control function and acquisition function. For this installation, the control IP is to be set differently than the acquisition IP. The control IP will be the lowest IP address on the sequence. Then you have to set the acquisition IP, which will be the next lowest IP in the sequence. When you do the setting, the IP address of the inverters must be in sequential order, then the controller take the sequence until reach the entered number of inverters. And again the RTU specification setting come into play for initialization and control function. The RTU initialization ID is used for all TCP frames related to protocol initialization routines such as the SunSpec map identification. The RTU control ID is used for TCP frames for both acquisition and control references. And the second scenario is ECPv2 connected to single or pool of inverters through a inverter controller. For example, SMA Inverter Manager. The control IP is to be set equal to the acquisition IP. And again the RTU specification setting come into play for the communication. The following setting will be applicable for initialization, control and acquisition. First, the RTU initialization ID is used for all TCP frames related to protocol initialization routines such as the SunSpec map identification. Secondly, The RTU control ID is used for the TCP frames related to control references. Thirdly, the RTU acquisition IDs are used for the TCP frames related to data acquisition. TCP RTU converter function can be used if ECPv2 is to coexist with a data logger, for instance. In this case, the control IP is to be set equal to the acquisition IP. The RTU specification setting will be used same as inverters controlled through a inverter manager on this situation. However, this approach is not recommended with big inverter clusters, as the Modbus TCP from ECPv2 will give references to the inverters individually. Advanced inverter command setup will be used to edit some extended configuration of EC-Web. On the inverter setting menu, you can see the advanced setting option on the right side. If you click on the setting option, you will lead to the first advanced inverter setting, which is common inverter command setup. Here the delay between transmission can be set. Which setting determine the transmission interval period between each transmission. Furthermore, the fallback timeouts for reverting to a predefined production level in case of loss of communication can be set up. This setting may be not necessarily need to edit more often, therefore you can leave as default. The next setting is SunSpec inverter command setup. This setting is disabled as default on our configuration. If you use any inverters other than SMA-STP inverters, then you need to enable the P and Q as continuous communication. The rest of the setting can be the default setup. You can further be enabled or disabled whether to include the multiple MPPT extended inverter model I160 as part of the inverter data acquisition if it relevant to your inverter model. The next setting under the advanced setting is secondary inverter setup. The ECPv2 can control a PV plant with a mix of up to 2 different inverter models. If this is the case for your installation, select your inverter protocol and enter the number of secondary inverters. On the primary inverter setup page, the number of inverters must be the total number of inverters in the plant. Secondary inverter support only applicable for non-SunSpec protocols running on Modbus RTU and using the Unicast command method. The Modbus IDs of all the inverters must be sequential, with the primary inverters having the lowest IDs in the sequence. The final setting under the advanced inverter setting is multiple cluster inverter setting. This setting allows you to edit the cluster capacity of each clusters and number of inverters in the clusters. Cluster context is defined as one or more inverters being connected to a superior data logger like a Hawaii i Smart Logger, SunGrowcom 100E, or a SMA inverter manager. The ECPv2 can control up to 32 inverter clusters. Please note that data acquisition of the individual inverters is limited to a maximum of 32 inverters. The final setting under the advanced inverter setting is multiple cluster inverter setting. This setting allows you to edit the cluster capacity of each clusters and number of inverters in the clusters. Thank you for watching the video. This video presented by Inkumi. For more information, please visit our website www.mcomb.com.